Welcome, viewers. You are about to hear a captivating tale written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. Don't forget to subscribe. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Widow's Clock Strikes Midnight. The night air was still as Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson made their way up the long, gravel path leading to the mansion of Lady Eveline Brackwell. The estate was grand, its stone facade bathed in the soft glow of lanterns flickering at the entrance. Holmes had accepted the invitation with a mixture of indifference and curiosity. The widow's personal request for his company seemed more like a distraction than a case. Yet, as they reached the front door, Holmes paused, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings, noticing every detail: the position of the shadows, the rustle of the trees, the distant hum of the city. There was something amiss, though he could not yet name it. The housekeeper, Miss Greaves, answered the door. Her usual composure was visibly shaken as she led them through the grand hallway. The scent of lavender lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the tension that seemed to seep from every corner of the mansion. Holmes took in the luxurious surroundings, ornate tapestries, polished wood, and antique furniture. Yet his mind was elsewhere, already piecing together the puzzle that awaited him. "Lady Brackwell is in her study, gentlemen," Miss Greaves said in a trembling voice, her eyes flickering toward the closed door at the end of the hall. "She insisted you join her immediately." Holmes nodded, following her without a word. Watson, ever the perceptive companion, kept close, sensing that something was wrong but unable to place it. They reached the study, and Miss Greaves, after a hesitant knock, turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The scene that greeted them was both unexpected and chilling. Lady Eveline Brackwell lay slumped in the leather chair by her desk, her lifeless form cast in the pale light of the flickering fire. Her once glamorous attire, rich velvet and lace, was now soiled with blood, the dark stain spreading from the wound at her chest. The letter opener, an ornate and delicate tool, was embedded in her heart, its handle carved with intricate patterns, familiar but strange. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes immediately assessing the scene. "A locked room mystery," he murmured, more to himself than to Watson, as he took in the surroundings. The room was still, too still. The clock, an ancient brass grandfather piece standing against the far wall, ticked away relentlessly, its hands pointed precisely at midnight. A peculiar detail, one that did not escape Holmes's attention. "It seems she did not die in her sleep, as we were led to believe," Watson remarked, moving cautiously around the room. He glanced at the desk, noting the disarray. Papers were scattered, some torn, some half-burned, and a few still smouldering in the fireplace. "There's something methodical about it, like she was preparing for something." Holmes's gaze flicked to the widow's personal effects, books, correspondence, trinkets, and then to the clock once more. He stood still for a moment, considering. "This is no mere act of violence," he said, his voice low and reflective. "There is meaning here, hidden within the details." Holmes moved around the room with methodical precision, his fingers brushing over the objects on the desk, his eyes scanning the scene. "The clock," he said suddenly, turning toward it. "It is not simply a decoration. It holds significance. Look, Watson." He gestured toward the clock's hands, which were perfectly aligned at midnight. "Why would anyone, in the course of committing a murder, ensure that the clock struck this precise hour?" Watson frowned, his brow furrowing. "Do you think it's a clue?" Holmes nodded. "I do. The clock is part of this. Its hands were set with care. It is deliberate, a statement, perhaps a symbol." His attention returned to the desk. He knelt down, his fingers carefully lifting a partially burned piece of paper that had fallen near the edge. The edges were singed, but the ink, though smeared, was still legible. "A name," Holmes muttered, squinting to make out the faint letters. "Monsieur Dupont, and something else." He tucked the paper into his coat pocket, then rose and turned toward the door. The housekeeper, still standing by the entrance, looked more distressed by the moment. "Is she—" Her voice faltered. Dead, Holmes confirmed gently, his tone cold but not unkind. But the question, Miss Greaves, is who killed her, and why? As they stepped back into the hallway, Watson's eyes lingered on the portrait hanging above the fireplace. It was a painting of Lady Brackwell, standing proud with an almost regal air about her, her eyes dark and knowing, as though they held secrets of their own. But it was the expression of the clock beneath her painted form that caught Watson's attention. The time on the clock in the painting? Exactly 12 o'clock. Holmes's face remained stoic, but in his eyes there was a flicker of excitement, a quiet understanding that this would not be a case solved easily. As they left the study, the air in the house seemed to grow heavier, and the silence felt oppressive, as though the mansion itself was holding its breath. "This will be a curious case, Watson," Holmes murmured as they walked toward the front door, "and one I suspect will take us down a path darker than we can imagine." The door clicked shut behind them, and as they stepped back into the cool night air, Holmes's mind raced, already piecing together the puzzle in front of him. This was no ordinary murder. The clock, the letter opener, the torn paper, all of it pointed to something far more complex. But for now they would wait. The mystery had just begun. The following morning found Holmes and Watson at the Brackwell estate once again. The sun had risen, casting pale light through the windows of the sitting room as they sat in silence, the weight of the previous night's discovery lingering in the air. Holmes, ever the picture of calm, sat in a plush armchair, his fingers steepled together as he considered the clues they had uncovered. Watson, on the other hand, paced restlessly. He had seen murder before, but this was different. There was an eerie stillness to the whole affair, a sense of careful orchestration that disturbed him. "Holmes," Watson said, pausing to glance at his friend, "you must have some thoughts on this already." Holmes nodded slowly, his sharp gaze never leaving the floor beneath him. "Indeed, Watson. There is much to consider, but one thing is clear. The murder was not random." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Lady Brackwell was not simply a victim of some fleeting criminal impulse. This was a targeted act designed with precision. The housekeeper, Miss Greaves, had been sent for, and now she stood at the door, her eyes red-rimmed from a night of restless sleep. Holmes motioned for her to enter, and she did so reluctantly, as if hesitant to approach the scene once again. "Miss Greaves," Holmes began, his voice soft but firm, "I understand this is a difficult time for you, but I must ask you to recount the events of last evening. Anything, no matter how insignificant it may seem, could be of great importance." The housekeeper shifted uneasily, her hands twisting in front of her. I don't know what more I can tell you, Mr. Holmes. I found her there, in her study, just as you did. She had been so looking forward to your visit. She seemed unsettled, but I didn't think it would come to this." "Unsettled?" Holmes's interest piqued at this. "In what way?" Miss Greaves's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment she seemed lost in thought. She mentioned something the night before, that her past was catching up with her, that there was something she couldn't escape. But when I asked her about it, she dismissed it, said it was nothing. Holmes's brow furrowed. "Did she say who or what might be pursuing her?" "No," Miss Greaves whispered. "She wouldn't say. Only that the clock—" Her voice faltered, but she pressed on. "The clock, Mr. Holmes. It had always been a symbol of her life, and she seemed so focused on it last night. She kept checking it, watching the time. I thought it strange, but, well, I didn't think much of it." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "The clock." He stood abruptly and moved toward the sitting room, his long fingers lightly brushing the edge of the nearby clock. "Yes, the clock is of great importance. It is as if the time was meant to be a warning. But a warning of what?" The silence hung thick in the room, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. Miss Greaves cleared her throat, glancing nervously at the detective. There was one other thing, sir, though I'm not sure how it relates. A man came by earlier in the week. He called himself Monsieur Dupont. He spoke briefly with Lady Brackwell about some rare clocks she had recently acquired. He was very insistent, though she seemed disinterested, and after he left she seemed unsettled again. I'm sorry, I don't know what it means. Monsieur Dupont, the name repeated in Holmes's mind like an echo. Thank you, Miss Greaves. You've been most helpful. As she turned to leave, Holmes motioned for Watson to follow him into the hallway. We must speak with this Monsieur Dupont, Watson. His name has come up too often to be disregarded. The investigation moved quickly after that. Holmes and Watson made their way to the office of Lady Brackwell's solicitor, Mr. Gables, a man of average build with the cold, calculating demeanour of someone who had spent years handling the affairs of the wealthy. His office, nestled in the heart of the city, smelled faintly of tobacco and ink. It was a place where deals were made and lives were planned, until, it seemed, something had gone terribly wrong. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, Mr. Gables greeted them with a forced smile. To what do I owe the pleasure of your visit this morning? We are here regarding Lady Brackwell's untimely death, Holmes replied without preamble. We are attempting to understand the circumstances surrounding her passing and any potential connections to those in her life. We have reason to believe you may be able to assist us. Mr. Gables's smile faltered, and his eyes flickered briefly toward a desk drawer before he composed himself. I assure you, gentlemen, I know nothing more than what was reported last night. My late client was in good health, and I was not made aware of any troubling matters in her life. Indeed, Holmes said, his voice steady. Yet we've learned that Lady Brackwell was involved in some rather exclusive dealings with rare clocks recently, one of which seems to have drawn the interest of a certain Monsieur Dupont. Were you aware of this? At the mention of the name, Gables' eyes hardened for the briefest of moments, before he leaned back in his chair. I was aware of her growing interest in rare antiquities. She did mention Monsieur Dupont in passing, but I cannot speak to the nature of their relationship. She kept those matters to herself. Holmes's gaze never left Gables. I see. And where were you, Mr. Gables, on the night of Lady Brackwell's death? The solicitor's lips tightened. I was at my residence, in the company of my family. You may verify that with anyone you wish. Holmes studied him for a moment longer, but said nothing more. Thank you for your time, Mr. Gables. We may be in touch again shortly. As they exited the office, Watson couldn't help but ask, Do you believe him, Holmes? Holmes's face remained impassive. I believe he's hiding something, Watson. The question is what? The following days brought with them a sense of unease, a growing realization that the more Holmes delved into the details, the less clear the path became. The initial clues, though intriguing, had only led them into a web of misdirection and uncertainty. Lady Brackwell's death, once a straightforward case of a locked-room murder, was now a puzzle filled with more pieces than seemed to fit. The house itself, which had once seemed so welcoming, now stood cold and imposing, its very walls seeming to harbour secrets. Holmes spent hours in the study, examining every inch of the room for signs of something they had missed. The clock, he found, was still pointing to midnight, though there was no reason for it to remain that way. It had been the same hour when Lady Brackwell had died. Did the time itself hold the key to her death? Or was it, as Watson feared, a mere coincidence? Watson, for his part, was growing more anxious with each passing hour. His suspicions about Monsieur Dupont had only deepened, yet every lead turned out to be a false one. The Frenchman had disappeared without a trace, and there was no sign of any clock-related dealings that Lady Brackwell might have been involved in. The solicitor, Mr. Gables, though seemingly harmless, remained an enigma, a man who was far too composed in the face of such a violent death. This is maddening, Watson said one evening as he sat beside Holmes in the sitting room. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the floor. Every step we take seems to lead us in a different direction. Monsieur Dupont has vanished, and Gables... Watson trailed off, his words heavy with frustration. I can't shake the feeling that something is being hidden from us. Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the flickering flames, his brow furrowed in concentration. I agree, Watson. But it is not uncommon for a case to grow more convoluted before the truth reveals itself. The clues we have gathered thus far, the clock, the letter opener, the torn paper, are all pieces of a larger picture. But that picture is not yet clear. The more we investigate, the more complicated it becomes. The door creaked open, and Miss Greaves entered, her face pale and drawn. She had been nervous when Holmes had last spoken with her, but now she looked genuinely distressed. Mr. Holmes, she began, her voice trembling, there is something you must see. It concerns Lady Brackwell's private collection. Holmes stood at once, his interest piqued. Lead the way, Miss Greaves. The housekeeper led them down a narrow hallway to a small, dimly lit room at the back of the house. The room was filled with shelves of antique clocks, their ticking a symphony of sound that seemed to echo through the air. The room, though well maintained, had an unsettling atmosphere, like a place where time itself stood still. There, Miss Greaves pointed toward a particular shelf at the far end of the room. It's one of Lady Brackwell's most prized possessions, a rare clock, thought to be lost to time. It was in perfect condition when I last saw it, but now it's been altered. Holmes moved forward, his sharp eyes immediately noticing the disarray. The clock in question, a beautifully crafted piece of silver and brass, was now missing its face. The delicate hands had been removed, and the glass covering the clock was shattered. What had once been a thing of beauty now appeared almost tragic, as if something vital had been ripped away. Who did this? Watson asked, his voice heavy with disbelief. Why would anyone destroy such a valuable piece? Miss Greaves's hands wrung together as she looked at the broken clock. I don't know, sir. It's as though someone was looking for something, but I don't understand. Why would anyone want to destroy it? Holmes knelt before the clock, his fingers brushing gently over the shattered glass. I believe the answer lies within this clock, Miss Greaves. This clock was not simply a prized possession. It was a message. Someone wanted to find something hidden within it, something that could not be left intact. The question is, what was hidden? The air in the room felt heavy, as though the very walls were closing in around them. The ticking of the remaining clocks seemed louder, more oppressive, as Holmes stood and surveyed the room once more. This is not merely a case of theft, Watson. This is a deliberate act of destruction. Whoever did this was trying to erase something. Watson's eyes narrowed. But what could it be? A hidden compartment? A map? A letter? Holmes did not answer immediately, his mind racing through the possibilities. Then, as if a thought had finally clicked into place, he turned sharply to Miss Greaves. Was there anyone who knew the inner workings of these clocks? Someone who could understand their construction well enough to tamper with them? Miss Greaves hesitated for a moment before answering. There was a clockmaker, a man named Bartok, who worked for Lady Brackwell in the past. He was quite skilled, but she dismissed him some months ago. She said he had become too obsessed with the clocks, as though they were the only thing that mattered to him. Holmes's expression hardened. Bartok, it seems we have our next lead. I suggest we pay him a visit. As they left the room, Watson could not shake the feeling that they were being led down a path that would only lead to more confusion. Every step they took seemed to open up more questions than answers. The clock, the letter opener, the shattered timepiece, all were connected. But how? And who stood to gain from Lady Brackwell's untimely death? The pieces were there, but the puzzle was far from solved. The journey to Bartok's residence was a quiet one, marked by a tension that hung heavily in the air. Holmes, as always, was composed, his mind racing with possibilities, but there was a flicker of something beneath his calm exterior, an understanding that the trail had grown far too intricate to ignore. Watson, though still uncertain of how everything tied together, shared his companion's growing unease. They arrived at the clockmaker's residence on a fog-choked street, tucked between rows of grey, crumbling buildings. The house, if it could even be called that, looked more like a workshop than a home. Its windows were shuttered tightly, and the scent of wood shavings and oil lingered in the air. The atmosphere was oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Holmes approached the door without hesitation, knocking twice in the manner of one who had been here before. The heavy silence that followed seemed to confirm Watson's fears. This was no ordinary visit. A few moments later, the door creaked open to reveal a tall man with thin, sunken features. His eyes, dark and sharp, flicked over them both with a hint of recognition, though he said nothing. "Mr. Bartok?" Holmes asked, his voice polite but firm. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We are investigating the death of Lady Eveline Brackwell, and we have reason to believe you may be able to assist us." The clockmaker's eyes darted to the doorframe, as if considering whether to admit them. Finally, he stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The interior of the house was dimly lit, cluttered with parts of clocks in various stages of assembly, their gears and mechanisms scattered across workbenches like broken fragments of time itself. A low hum of ticking filled the room, an oddly comforting sound in such an unsettling space. Holmes wasted no time. "Mr. Bartok, we understand that you were once employed by Lady Brackwell. She had an impressive collection of clocks, some of which we believe may hold more than mere sentimental value." Bartok gave a short, humourless laugh. "Sentimental value? No, Mr. Holmes, I know better than to deal with that nonsense. The clocks were not merely things to decorate her home. They were tools of great importance." Watson's brow furrowed at the man's sudden shift in tone. "What do you mean by that?" Bartok's gaze turned inward, and for a moment he seemed lost in his thoughts. Lady Brackwell had something that many would kill for, something that was hidden in the clocks themselves. Holmes stepped closer, his interest piqued. "Something hidden? And you were tasked with—" "Maintaining them," Bartok interrupted. "But I soon learned more about her obsession with these timepieces. It wasn't enough to simply fix them. She had me design them in a way no one would notice. Compartments, hidden mechanisms that only someone like me could recognize." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "And when I realized what she was up to, I tried to warn her." Holmes's sharp eyes never left Bartok's face. "Warn her of what, exactly?" The clockmaker's shoulders tensed. "There were those who were after her collection. People who knew what she had. People who would stop at nothing to get it." Watson looked between the two men, the room suddenly feeling much smaller. "But why not go to the authorities? Why would Lady Brackwell keep such dangerous secrets?" Bartok's laugh was hollow, filled with bitterness. "She trusted no one, and frankly neither did I. I had no proof, no concrete evidence of who was behind it, but I knew she was playing a dangerous game." Holmes nodded slowly, processing the information. "Do you know where the clocks are now? The ones with the hidden compartments?" Bartok's expression darkened. "I do, but I cannot help you, Mr. Holmes. You don't understand what you're asking. The clocks were the key to something far more valuable than you could imagine, something that should have stayed buried." Holmes's expression remained unreadable, but Watson could feel the tension in the room rising. "You're saying Lady Brackwell was in possession of something. What, exactly?" Bartok's gaze shifted nervously, his eyes darting around the cluttered room. He seemed to weigh his words carefully before speaking again. The clocks. They were not just timepieces. They were designed to open a map to a treasure, one hidden for centuries, buried deep within the vaults of the old clockmakers' guild. The clock she prized above all others was the last piece of the puzzle. Watson stepped forward, his voice rising with urgency. "A treasure map? You're telling me she was murdered over—" "Yes," Bartok cut in sharply. "She was murdered because she had the final piece. Someone found out, and they took it from her, before she could decipher it herself." Holmes's mind raced. The widow's obsession with time had taken on a new light. Lady Brackwell had not just been a collector, She had been a keeper of secrets, a guardian of a treasure that someone was willing to kill for. The letter opener, the clock at midnight, the shattered face, all were parts of a far larger puzzle, one that now had a more tangible form. "Where is the clock now, Mr. Bartok?" Holmes asked, his voice low and controlled. Bartok's face twisted with fear. "I don't know, but I can tell you this. The clock was the key. Without it, you'll never find what's hidden." Holmes stood in silence for a moment, his gaze lingering on the broken clocks surrounding them. "Then we must find the clock, and when we do, we will uncover the truth behind Lady Brackwell's death." The atmosphere in the room felt heavy with the weight of Bartok's words. The clock, it seemed, was not just a timepiece. It was the final piece of the puzzle that had cost Lady Brackwell her life. And now, it was only a matter of time before Holmes would uncover the final mystery. The fog had thickened by the time Holmes and Watson left Bartok's workshop, their minds swirling with the new information they had uncovered. The clock, the treasure map, the mysterious force that had driven Lady Brackwell to seek out these ancient timepieces. Everything was beginning to take shape, but with each answer came a dozen more questions. "Holmes, I can't help but feel we're missing something," Watson said, his voice tense as they made their way back to the streets. "This treasure, why would anyone go to such lengths to keep it hidden?" Holmes's expression remained unreadable as he adjusted his scarf against the chill wind. "Some things are worth more than gold, Watson. The clock, the treasure, they represent power. Power over time, power over history. People are willing to kill for such things." Watson cast a glance over his shoulder, as though expecting someone to be following them. "But why go after Lady Brackwell? Why her?" Holmes hesitated, a fleeting look crossing his face. "She was a key holder, Watson. And in the wrong hands, that makes her dangerous." As the two men moved deeper into the foggy streets, the sense of urgency grew palpable. Holmes's mind was racing. Lady Brackwell's death had been no accident, and it was clear now that someone wanted more than just her life. They wanted what she knew, what she had. The muffled sound of footsteps behind them broke Holmes from his reverie. Turning abruptly, he saw nothing but the thick fog closing in around them. He had no reason to be alarmed. Not yet. But something in his gut told him they were being watched. "We need to get to the clock," Holmes murmured. "That is the key." Watson nodded, his unease palpable. "Do you think we're close to finding it?" Holmes paused and glanced around. "I do. But we must be cautious. We are no longer dealing with an ordinary thief. We're dealing with someone who understands the value of this mystery." The alleyways and narrow streets were eerily quiet, their dimly lit lanterns casting long shadows across the cobblestones. As they approached the corner of a darkened street, a figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking their path. The man was tall, his features obscured by the mist, but there was a menacing presence in his stance. "Mr. Holmes?" The man's voice rang out, low and smooth, like oil on water. "I must say, your persistence is admirable." Holmes stopped in his tracks, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of his walking stick. "And you are?" The figure stepped closer, his face slowly emerging from the shadows. It was a face that Holmes recognized, though the recognition came with a chilling sense of foreboding. "Monsieur Dupont," Holmes said, his voice steady but laced with tension. Dupont's lips curled into a thin smile. "I see you've been doing your homework. How disappointing. I was hoping to keep this little treasure hunt a secret." Watson tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his pocket, though Holmes made a slight gesture to stop him. He took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Dupont's. "What do you want, Dupont? If it's the clock you're after, you'll find that your pursuit is futile." Dupont chuckled softly, a sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Futile, you say? Perhaps. But there are forces far stronger than your wit, Mr. Holmes, and they have already decided the clock will be mine." Holmes's brow furrowed. "And what do these forces want with it? What does it contain that is worth so much death?" DuPont's smile faltered for a moment, his eyes darkening. "It is not for you to understand. You are simply a nuisance, Mr. Holmes. A clever nuisance, but a nuisance nonetheless." Before Holmes could respond, DuPont made a swift motion, and from behind him, two more figures stepped forward, their faces hidden beneath hoods. Each one held a weapon, short, curved blades glinting ominously in the pale light of the lanterns. "Holmes," Watson warned, his voice laced with alarm, but Holmes's response was calm. His mind was already working, calculating the next move, analyzing every possible outcome. "We do not wish for bloodshed, Dupont," Holmes said, his tone colder now. "But if you continue down this path, you will have more than your share of regret." Dupont's eyes narrowed, and the tension in the air grew thick, as though the very street was holding its breath. "Regret is a luxury I can't afford, Mr. Holmes. The clock will be mine, and nothing you do can stop it." The words hung in the air like a threat, the oppressive silence only broken by the distant sound of footsteps. Footsteps that seemed to approach ever so slowly, as though time itself was standing still. Holmes knew they were outnumbered, and Dupont's words held more weight than he cared to admit. This was no longer a game of wits. This was a matter of survival. "Get ready, Watson," Holmes muttered under his breath, and in that instant, the world seemed to shift. The tension exploded in a flurry of movement. The tension in the alleyway was palpable, suffocating, as Holmes faced Dupont and his two associates, their blades gleaming faintly in the dim light. Watson's hand twitched towards his own pocket, but Holmes held up a hand, signaling him to stay calm. In that moment, Holmes knew the stakes were higher than they had ever been. This was not simply a fight over a clock, it was a battle over something much greater, something that could change everything. Dupont's cold smile never wavered as the two cloaked figures flanked him, their eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "You think you can stop me, Holmes?" he asked, his voice laced with mockery. "I have already won. The treasure, the clock. It's all mine now. Your pursuit was nothing more than a distraction." Holmes's gaze never left Dupont's face, but inside, his mind was working at an astonishing speed, calculating his next move. The fog swirled around them like a living thing, blurring the lines between the present and the past, reality and the mystery that had consumed them all. "You're wrong," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of truth. "The clock is not yours, Dupont. It never was. You've been chasing a shadow all this time." Dupont's brow furrowed, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "The clock." Holmes raised his hand, cutting him off. "The clock was never meant to be a treasure, Dupont. It was a symbol, a key to something far more elusive. Lady Brackwell understood that, and so did Bartok." Watson, confused, glanced at Holmes. "What do you mean, Holmes? If the clock isn't the treasure—" "The treasure was never the point," Holmes continued, turning toward Watson, his voice calm yet filled with conviction. "The map, the hidden compartments, the intrigue, it was all a smokescreen. The clock was designed to lead to something far more dangerous than gold. Lady Brackwell had discovered that the true power lay not in what was hidden, but in controlling who had the knowledge of how to find it." Dupont's expression darkened as he stepped forward, brandishing his blade. "Enough with your riddles, Holmes. If you know what's really going on, then tell me. Tell me how it ends." Holmes held his ground, his eyes unblinking. "It ends with you, Dupont, but not in the way you expect." In a flash, Holmes moved, faster than Dupont had anticipated. He sidestepped the advancing figure and struck with precision, knocking the blade from Dupont's hand and sending it clattering across the cobblestones. The two cloaked figures hesitated, but Dupont's anger fueled him, and he lunged at Holmes with a snarl. "Holmes, look out!" Watson shouted, but Holmes was already prepared. He moved with such grace and control that Dupont's attack fell short, and with a swift motion, Holmes disarmed him. The once confident criminal now found himself on the ground, his breath heavy and ragged, his weapon rendered useless. You've been playing a game of deception, Dupont, Holmes said, his voice low but steady. But the truth is always revealed in the end, no matter how deep you bury it. Dupont looked up at him, eyes filled with rage and disbelief. You think you've won? You've only uncovered the smallest piece of the puzzle. The clock may have lost its power, but there are others. You can't stop what's coming. Holmes knelt down, his gaze never leaving Dupont's face. The clock isn't the key anymore, he said softly. The real treasure was never the treasure. It was the knowledge you were willing to kill for. But it's over now, Dupont. You've lost. Before Dupont could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps reached their ears. From the mist emerged a figure, a man in a dark cloak, his face hidden beneath the hood. As he stepped closer, Holmes's eyes widened with recognition. It was Bartok. "Holmes!" Bartok said, his voice betraying no emotion. "It's over!" Dupont's expression faltered as he looked between Holmes and the clockmaker. You betrayed me?" he spat, his voice filled with venom. "Not betrayal," Bartok replied coolly. "You never understood the game, Dupont. It was never about the clock or the treasure. It was about controlling who held the key. And you were never meant to be the one." The realization hit Holmes with the force of a sudden storm. Dupont had been a pawn, manipulated by forces beyond his control, drawn into a web of lies and deception. The true mastermind had been Bartok all along. It was his intricate understanding of the clocks, of the secrets they held, that had made him a valuable player in this twisted game. Dupont's face twisted in fury. "You think you've won? You think you can stop the tide from coming in? There are always others, Holmes. Always." Holmes met his gaze with an unsettling calm. "The game is over, Dupont. You've lost." With that, Bartok stepped forward, his eyes cold as he surveyed the defeated figure. "Take him," he commanded, and two men emerged from the shadows, dragging Dupont away into the night. Holmes stood, his thoughts already returning to the mystery that had drawn him here. The clock, the treasure, the lies. It had all been part of a greater scheme, one that had ultimately come to an end. But there would always be more mysteries, more puzzles to solve. That was the nature of his work. As the fog began to lift and the first light of dawn began to break through the mist, Holmes and Watson stood together in the alley, the weight of the case finally lifting from their shoulders. "Is it over, Holmes?" Watson asked quietly, his voice tinged with exhaustion. Holmes glanced at him, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "For now, Watson, but the mysteries never truly end. They only change." With that, the two of them walked into the morning light, the case of Lady Brackwell's death resolved, but the endless labyrinth of questions ever present in their lives.